Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet.
This review covers the re-released Shell Lockeheed Vega kit from AMT in 1/48 scale. It's kit number 950. Round 2 has rated this a skill level 2 kit for ages 10 and above, but I'd recommend it for more experienced builders. In the box you get 41 parts molded in yellow and clear plastic with cartograph water slide decals. There are 2 extra pieces in the kit which aren't used, and a simple line drawing fold out instruction sheet. It's a simple build with a one-piece motor and no interior to speak of. The challenge here lies in the finishing. The decals are made well, but they're thicker than usual, which helps small hands install them, but they don't conform well to surface features. Overall, the kit is 10¼ inches wide, 6 3/4 inches long, and 2½ inches high. Although our pint-sized pilot seems to be having trouble getting his plane started, we'll show you how to build this kit from start to finish. Here's the layout of the pieces that come in the kit. It turns out there are 2 extra pieces in this kit. The pieces that are shown here in the white circle are the ones you'll be using for the motor and the tail skid. On the back of the kit, the diagram doesn't even show that these parts are here. In fact, it indicates, as you'll see, the arrows point to the 2 pieces that will not be used. The copyright script is shown here on the inside of one of the wing panels. But as you can see, the plastic is so thin on this kit you can see right through to the copyright script. So I removed it using a little bit of lacquer thinner. It wipes clean, comes right off. As I mentioned, the plastic is thin and you can see right through to some of the features on the inside of the model. There's also some cold shuts there where the mold knits together, so I elected to spray the entire contents with a light gray primer. The moldings in this kit were remarkably well preserved. There's hardly any flash. There will be a few parting lines and some ejector pins that you'll have to address, but for the most part it's a very cleanly molded kit. Unlike the molds, it appears that the instructions were not updated. This clearly shows a single piece for each window set on the sides of the fuselage, but in fact these parts were molded individually, and that actually adds for realism. Put a small piece of tape on these parts and clip them out from the tree so that they don't go flying off into the carpet. Don't ask me how I know this. Finish off the only interior piece, which is the cabin bulkhead, by painting it yellow. I followed the instructions callouts by painting the pilot with a gray suit, flesh hands, a white shirt, brown hair, and I gave him a red tie too. He is flying executives around. Clean off the sides of the bulkhead there, and note that that circle goes to the top and the seat is sticking out, will face forward for the pilot. We'll be placing that into the fuselage half where the white arrow indicates on the red line. Now glue the bulkhead into the fuselage half there in between those 2 upright posts. Notice it also covers up a small hole there which we'll have to deal with later. In some cases, like the fuselage halves, it's sometimes a good idea to cut off the locating tabs so that you can align the parts more successfully. In this case, I just had to clip off the one near the tail end so that the parts would be aligned properly, then glued the fuselage halves together. I also painted the window frames yellow to make sure that they got covered. For a nicely finished model, you'll need to address the seams that occur when you put 2 halves together. I like this Bondo spot putty and glaze, but any modeling putty will work. Just apply it, let it dry, and then sand it to a smooth finish. I drilled a hole in the forward fuselage bulkhead here and put a small stick into it so that I could hold it for painting. I also painted the window ledges a yellow to make sure that they would get covered. Then I taped them over along with the cockpit to redo the whole fuselage with primer. Paint the prop silver but not the prop shaft, and then I used some black wash, which is really just thinned out black paint, to add some definition to the propeller hub. I used the same treatment on the rotary engine here until I found that it would not fit into the engine cowling. So I threw it away and did the same thing to the one on the left, which is the one we will use. Gather the parts for the tail planes and assemble them with some glue, using some clamps to hold them in place until the glue sets properly. I used the sharp tip of a hobby knife to hollow out the exhaust pipes on the engine cowl. It makes it look much more realistic that way. Assemble the correct engine into the cowling and paint the inside of the cowling with a dark red color. Assemble the two halves of the cowling together around the engine and then use some of that putty to address the seams there. After it's dried and you've finished it off, then tape off the engine from the front and back side and add a stick to the rear of the engine to hold on to the piece so that you can prime it to get it a nice even primed color. Assemble both halves of the wheel fairings and clamp them together until they dry. Clean off the edges, and then once they've been cured, I put a flat on the bottom of the wheels at an angle that the plane would set to give it the appearance of weight on the tires. Use some toothpicks to mount the wheel fairings so that you can paint those with another light coat of primer, and then spray the pieces here as shown with some dark red. I actually used a little bottle red paint that I had darkened with some black to match the color of the decals on the rest of the kit. The instructions have you installing the lower portion of the wings to the fuselage first and then adding the top portion of the wings, but I elected to put the wings together in their entirety and used a block of plastic to make sure that they didn't collapse when I pressed down on them to mate that to the fuselage. I did this so that I could clean up the edges of the wings and prime it before I painted. Get the fuselage ready for the wings and the tail planes by scraping off any of the paint that's on the gluing surfaces. And make sure that you've cleaned up the edges of those parts too. I used some 5-minute epoxy to glue the wing to the fuselage on the top, and then I also used some tape and a French curve to apply a mask for the red portions of the paint on the forward end of the fuselage. You'll need to test fit the tail planes here, and I found that it was best to kind of scrape off the outer portions of the horizontal stabilizers in order to make sure that they fit into the sockets on the fuselage. And then I used some super glue to glue them into place. I used a Krylon Bauhaus Gold number 51801 to paint my fuselage and the landing gear struts. I started out with a couple of mist coats, followed up by about 3 or 4 wet coats. This will give you a nice even finish, so set it aside to dry thoroughly. I used some masking tape to cover up the back side of the fairing, then removed the toothpick and covered up the other side as well. Then I got out a French curve to draw and use for a form to cut that curve at the forward end of the wheel fairing nacelle. As you've noticed, you don't get decals for these parts, so they've been painted red, and now we have to paint the rest of that fairing yellow. After you've cut the tape away, use some clear flat spray to keep paint from creeping under the edge. Remount the parts with the toothpicks, then paint the exposed areas with the yellow spray. Remove the tape, and there you have it, a nice looking fairing. Now you can remove the tape from the fuselage to reveal the red portion and get the model ready for decals. These are some great decals. The registry is good and the color is deep, but they're a little on the thick side. And as try as you might, you're never going to get those seams to all match up at the edges. So apply the decals, and I strongly suggest you use some decal setting solution like Micro Scale Industries products to make sure that they try and conform as close as possible to the body contours. Use some of that paint you mixed up for the wheel spats and the fuselage to touch up the edges where there's some yellow showing through so that it matches the decals. In addition to the two colored wheel spats, I painted the wheels silver and the tire portions with a flat black. Also, gather the rest of those suspension pieces to assemble the landing gear. Remember earlier where the bulkhead inside the fuselage was covering one of those holes? Well, it's one of these wheel strut holes. So I took a small drill and I drilled those out cleanly so that the pegs on the struts would fit in and glue properly there. Using some slow setting tube glue, I glued the larger struts to the fairings and the tubular struts to the fuselage. Note that the smaller portion of the tube struts go forward. Use some of that tube glue to complete the suspension by adding the main struts to the body and the other struts. Now, turn the model over and adjust the landing gear for symmetry and make sure that the wingtips are at the same height from the ground so that the appearance of the plane is level from the front and the back. Turn the plane upside down and let the landing gear dry in place. Finish off the engine cowl by painting the exhaust tubes silver and also inserting the prop shaft into the engine, and with a little dab of glue on the retaining button, place that on the end of the prop shaft on the back side. Before it dries, spin it a few times and make sure that it still has motion. I used a fine paintbrush to paint the framework red on the canopy using some acrylic red paint, and then I used a toothpick after it had started to dry to remove any excess paint from those braces on the canopy. Now we can finish up our plane by adding the pilot and some external pieces. When you go to put the cockpit in, remove any of the masking that you had inside there, and then glue the pilot into place using the tab on his back to insert into the hole at the top of the back wall. Then squeeze the canopy just a little bit on the sides and she'll fit right into the section of the wing that's cut out for it, nice and snug. As far as the side windows go, make sure that you use the beveled edge to go in first into the window openings, and use a little bit of that clear part cement or some white glue like Elmer's to install those there. Then glue the engine cowling into place, and at this point I removed the tabs or the studs that were at the backing plate of the cowling, and it fits real nicely right onto the fuselage using some glue there. Finally, the tail skid needs to be glued into the hole at the back of the fuselage, and there it is. You're all done. Overall, this kit fit together very well, and the decals were nice but thick and need some setting solution to adhere. Also, there's some sections that need to be painted and masked, so I would not recommend this to a beginning builder. It takes some intermediate skills in my opinion. There were a couple of errors in the instructions, and one of the decal sets was reversed. On the tail, the registration numbers should go on the main part of the tail instead of on the rudder, but those are marked incorrectly on the instructions, and after I had applied them I realized my mistake, so make sure that you look for that. Other than that, the individual windows make for some good realism, and the kit looks great when you're finished. I think you'll be proud to put it on your shelf. We hope you've liked this step-by-step how to build it review, but so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us on Facebook, and we're also on the web at www.rightonreplicas.com. Thanks!